It's so wonderful to see so many friends here this evening. Those people who have been with us for all of our sessions and those people who have come for the first time. I think that's probably because we have the most wonderful speaker this evening, Rabbi Jackie Tabick. Rabbi Tabick may be known to many within the liberal community as the first British female rabbi, ordained in 1975. But those of you who may be fans of Jackie's for many years and have just come here just because, I won't use the word stalk, but you, you follow her around, will maybe know her from West London Synagogue, Northwest Surrey Synagogue, as convener of the Beit Din. Maybe some of you have met Jackie on a Beit Din, and also latterly as rabbi of West Central Liberal Synagogue as well. Of course, West Central Liberal Synagogue, based and founded by Lea Montague in 1928, although it had its roots much earlier than that, and based in what I know as the Montagu Centre in 1954. I'm old enough to be able to say I remember when it was the synagogue upstairs, and it was the offices of ULPS downstairs. And I loved going up the dual stairs up to the sanctuary and to the West Central Liberal Synagogue. I do just want to say, though, that more recently, a group of Kabbalat Torah children and students had a wonderful tour around the West End of London, a sort of treasure hunt. And it ended up at the West Central Liberal Synagogue, where they learned from Rabbi Jackie about who they defined as being their Jewish suffragettes, and were being so inspired by Lea Montague, who many of them hadn't heard about. They were also, though, immensely inspired by the woman who spoke to them about Lea Montague. They said of Rabbi Jackie Tabick, it was as if we were in the presence of royalty. Her pronunciation, her erudition, her thought so impressed our young people. It was a true inspiration to them. I promised not to embarrass her. I hope that didn't, because actually it was just the way, and it was really what my daughter said to me when she came home, having experienced Rabbi Jackie. So thank you so much for being here this evening. We'll hand over to you. And you have as the background the West Central Liberal Synagogue. It's wonderful to see that as well.
Right. I thought it was most appropriate to have the background of the synagogue, which I had grown to love, and I am very sad that we have closed our doors. But I'm still using the backdrop, and I hope that you will enjoy it with me. And thank you, Aaron, for your words. You did embarrass me, of course, but yes, well, maybe I'll get a chance to revenge myself on you at some point. I think we should all have that chance occasionally. So tonight, friends, I'm going to show you a PowerPoint on Lea Montague. Obviously, I've taken a selection of photographs from the period in which she lived to illustrate some of her concerns. I couldn't magically get photographs of her at all points in the history of that period. So I hope you'll excuse that. Those of you who are like historical accuracy will forgive me for this. So this is a portrait taken of Lea Montague around 1899. And it is one which I adore, and I think it shows a lot of the strength of this woman, this Victorian woman who espoused what were some of the best of Victorian values. So what I'd like to do first is just remind you of the conditions of the time in which she lived. So she was around in obviously maybe not totally aware of, but certainly later she would have been aware of the terrible conditions in which the poor worked in those days. So in 1888, there was the London Match Girls strike at the teenage girls working for Bryant and May factory in Bow. The girls were working 14-hour days, poor pay, excessive fines if they took any time off, and were working with white phosphorus, which meant that they had terrible problems such as phossy jaw. But the actual strike was sparked by the dismissal of one of the workers. And this shows you another area of work, not in a factory for the making of the matches, but in a garment industry, a sweatshop of the era.
Jackie, you just need to press the screen share again. We can't see it at the moment.
Ah, hang on, I've got to get back then. Ha. I thought it was going too simply. Right, hang on. Screen share.
That's
Serves me
fabulous,
right,
Jackie.
setting it up in the beginning. There you are. You got it now?
Yes, that's right.
Right, I'm going to zip through the first 3 pictures. There you go. All right. So, remembering what the conditions were like at the end of the 19th century, she wrote later, the wages of women and girls were so low that it's not surprising that they regarded their working life as a temporary evil rather than as a career in which it was desirable to be as efficient as possible. Girls, or at any rate Jewish girls, were expected to marry, and they often married for the sake of deliverance from the crushing circumstances of their lives. Most of my girls, in the early days of the club, were tailoresses in domestic workshops, like the picture I just showed you. The employers had to carry on their work near the big, fashionable West End retail shops. Rents were inordinately high, and it was necessary to live near the shop, so that rooms had to be used for living and working purposes. The average working hours were 8 a.m. to 8 p.m, with an hour for dinner and half an hour for tea. And I love this bit. In hot weather, the men often worked stripped to the waist, and the atmosphere created by overheated bodies was anything but pleasant. Many of our girls worked for very long hours as dressmakers and milliners. It seemed remarkable that children could survive the strain of such protracted sedentary occupation. And then, of course, there was the politics of the time, so that we have in 1918 a vote granting the act of the right to vote to women over the age of 30, but only those who were householders, wives of householders, or occupiers of property with an annual rent of at least £5. Isn't that amazing? £5 rent. And questions around the suffragette movement drew attention to the marginal role of women in synagogues. Yes, there was a crossover there, though Lady Lily herself was never involved in the suffragette movement. There was also a big thing going about Jack the Ripper in those days, with the fear of uncontrolled sexuality of the poor. Though in fact, it's discovered in recent research that the victims of Jack the Ripper were not prostitutes themselves really, but homeless women. But even so, there was the immigration that was going on. Nathan Adler, the chief rabbi for 35 years until 1880, said most of these refugees came without livelihoods. They couldn't support themselves, and they contravene the will of their maker on account of poverty and overwork, violate the Shabbat and festivals. Some are ensnared in the net of the missionaries and renounce their religion. May the merciful save. Woe to the eyes which see and the ears which hear such things. And it was obvious that they were different from the normal population. They had different languages, dress, social, and of course religious habits. And they were obvious on the English streets. And for the settled Jewish community, only recently enfranchised in 1858, the visibility was destabilizing. It stirred up anti-Semitism. I mean, just look at this cartoon. You know, anti-immigrant views are by no means new. And Samuel Montagu, who was, of course, her father, had done an enormous lot of work in order to try and meet the challenge of getting these immigrants to assimilate to English ways as quickly as possible, while making sure that they could retain their Jewish identity and faith. So, social stuff, political stuff, immigration, and then you've got the growth of the reform movement in Germany, though there doesn't seem to have been a lot of crossover. West London Synagogue was founded in 1842, and David W. Marks was, of course, the first rabbi of that congregation. But until the 20th century, changes at West London, in fact, were minimal. Rabbi Marks, Reverend Marks, as he was really, was a Torah fundamentalist. He was still thinking about, I suppose, the documentary hypothesis, the ideas of higher criticism coming out from Germany from the 1860s. But in general, at West London, you have men and women separate. They were, in fact, on the High Holy Days separate until I started there as a student, when it became obvious that it was a bit stupid to have a woman student rabbi who would come down and read an odd bit from the Bima, who then had to go up to the women's gallery afterwards to take a seat. And things changed rapidly at that point. But in those days, in Lily Montagu's days, it was separate. And look how they dressed, isn't it wonderful? People walked to shul. That was in fact the reason West London was founded, because the ladies in their crinoline dresses didn't want to go along the muddy roads to the East End of London. And the liturgy, based on the Sephardi liturgy mainly, was changed very little. They did have an organ. They did have an English prayer for the royal family and an English sermon. And eventually they had an English Haftarah, and they shortened the Torah readings. And there was appetite for reform, even from some of the Orthodox rabbis. Certainly their members and members of West London Synagogue did socialize. This is how West London used to be, with the bima at the middle of the congregation, sort of towards us, and those beautiful stairs in their complete semicircle. It's a shame they ever changed it. A philosophical challenge that Lily Montagu faced in her time was, of course, the teachings of Darwin, which again challenge religious ideas from the in the Jewish community. Now, she was born as part of the cousinhood, the 6th of 10 children. This is a picture of her father, Samuel Montagu, who was a millionaire, a banker, a liberal MP, but that's not quite the same as modern liberal MPs, of course, and first Baron Swaythling, working in the House of Lords. He was always very orthodox. Her mother was Ellen, and in the words of her daughter Lily, she remained faithful all her life to the orthodox observances, both great and small. But Lily believed she did this out of wifely duty rather than personal conviction. She felt that her mother's religious elasticity allowed bringing English prayers into their home, stressed the importance of spontaneous prayer, and most importantly, believed that one could not expect young people to want the pattern of their lives to be identical to the previous generations. This is a caricature of her father in Vanity Fair. She appreciated the loving understanding of her mother, and she herself was called mother by a vast number of girls and women at the club, even people that she sent down when she was a magistrate to prison would write her letters, "Dear Mother." She was this incredible mother figure without, of course, having any children of her own. She had a very deep personal sense of communion with God. When little and she had night terrors, her mother would say, "Listen, your father is so good, God won't take him from his little girl." And her dad would come and hold her hand, and they would say Psalm 23 together. And this led to her love of Psalms all her life, and her strong belief in God's love and justice that would accompany her. But by 15 years old, she was convinced that orthodoxy offered her and other women little room for religious self-expression. She longed to become closer to God, but she felt unable to do so as she had had a very limited religious education. She didn't know much Hebrew. She learnt, of course, some theology and the idea of trust in God. But how can you be, she wondered, part of a worshipping community that basically ignored her? She regularly recited a prayer asking God to teach her to pray and to make her grateful for the opportunities to serve him. She enjoyed Bible stories and turned to social services, discovering there a means of serving God, as well as giving her purpose and direction in her life. It was a time of great change in the lives of the so-called leisured classes. The education the girls received was too good to allow them any longer to be content with small home duties, which in other previous generations had satisfied unmarried women. The new generation felt the need to justify their existence by some form of useful effort. And by 1890, she was running children's services in the new West End Synagogue. She understood how utterly boring the services were to children. I love this. She said, if they prayed at all, it was that the services should come to a speedy end. The rabbi of that synagogue was Reverend Singer of Singer's Prayer Book fame. And he was also Lily Montague's religious teacher for many years. He introduced her to the prophets. When she was ill, he prayed with her, and he helped write a special prayer book for the children's services. There were about 50 people who came with their mothers. They had a modified Amidah. They left out the burnt offerings. They sang some psalms and some songs in English with no repetition. And the JC in an article said, They should have services for young girls and women in the East End. And Nathan Adler, who was, of course, being the chief rabbi, wrote the English prayer. Can you imagine it? Yes, he wrote the English prayer. The first service of the group had 200 participants. And for a few years, Shabbat afternoon services were held in Hampstead Synagogue and had a mixed choir. She understood that the more we have, the greater our self-questioning and the more severe our responsibility. And in some ways, I've taken more time with the social stuff that Lily Montagu was responsible for, because the religious stuff, probably most of you know more than I do. But the social stuff has been lost along the way. She founded the West Central Jewish Girls Club in 1893 with her sister Marion and her cousin Beatrice Franklin. They had no training, and you can imagine the gap between her and the girls that came to the club. But she understood her responsibility. Someone suggested that she understood this having read about the Victorian novels, and you've seen the Victorian heroines expressed in those novels. She gave working class Jewish girls the opportunity to develop themselves socially, intellectually, and spiritually through Shabbat afternoon services, which she led, concerts, outings, and other events. The services were brief in English, sermons on topics she felt vital interest to the girls, retained only those traditional prayers which she thought had meaning for modern Jews and Jewesses. And they were in the afternoon, so they wouldn't rival in any way the Orthodox services being offered. Maybe she wanted to avoid at this point her father's ire, and she didn't really challenge the status quo of Orthodox authorities. But it helped women, the working girls, enormously. According to Nellie Levy, who was an early member of the West Central Club, later a leader, Lily was motivated by a vision she experienced in 1892. There we see her Sir Herbert Samuel and his wife. Are the clothes gorgeous? I want one of those. But as a girl, she dreamed this vision where she saw her sisters needing guidance and friendship to be lifted out of squalor and shown light. She was absolutely worried at the children forced to become breadwinners. And she saw them give us opportunities denied us. We need light, space, and knowledge. And so she set upon herself the task of bringing them through a faith in Judaism so they may have strength therewith to live. And God blessed her, and she awoke. So again, we see the circumstances in which so many Jewish people were working in this period. They were involved, especially in the Soho schmutter trade. And one of the young ladies there had said to her, you know, if you start a club, we'll go. And so that's why she started the club. And there was in Frith Street for the Jewish girls in the sweatshops. When the numbers had reached 17, they went off to Dean Street. And her sister joined her in the work, and they had classes. And the ladies made the girls feel that they had a richer life available to them. Most of the girls and their parents had come over from Russia and Poland, escaping persecution, and Miss Lily was busy integrating them into the English way of life. So she ran classes in English for foreigners, and the membership of these classes reached 70. And in 1893, West Central Jewish Club for Working Girls was there to bring brightness and refinement into the lives of Jewish working girls. She believed that the low wages, lower of course than boys, caused girls to think of themselves as cheap, and that they should only have to work until they got married. Industrial organization amongst girls was considered irrelevant. This undermined any sense of responsibility which might have developed amongst the girls, and it was sheer drudgery. So the educational work of the club was designed to increase skills and encourage aspiration. Many girls and women were at that point the main breadwinners of the families, particularly within religious families where male education was considered to be of more importance than female, but the males were busy with Jewish education while the women earned the money. The self-worth of such young women could only be improved, she felt, by improved wages and training, one through self-directed industrial organizations. As a member, and it's another picture of the work they're doing, as a member of the Women's Industrial Committee, Lily Montagu was honorary secretary of the club's Industrial Association to educate young female workers about factory acts and use girls' clubs as a basis for industrial organization. 1911, they had some disputes over policies for minimum wages, and the club's industrial association became fully independent and then joined and helped create the National Organization of Girls' Clubs. At the beginning of the war, she formed workshops because the girls were at that point their work just stopped overnight. They had nothing to bring home. So she set up workshops for them so they could continue to earn money until the economy sorted itself out and they were able to get their jobs back again. Now, Lily's work in this area was, of course, it became part of the history of the trade union movement, but her work was totally forgotten by the trade unions. I think partly because it was, the sort of period where the needs of boys and men were seen as so much more important as breadwinners, even though, as I said, in the Jewish community, it was the women who were the breadwinners, even so. And as so often happens, the work of pioneers of women gets forgotten. They just weren't appreciated. It was unnatural that these women should be doing all this stuff. So the politics, she didn't get involved in trying to change the politics, like she wasn't in the suffragette movement. What she was interested in is changing the actual situation in which the women found themselves. And there's a quotation here from Emmeline Pethwick Lawrence, who did her own work with the Esperance Girls Club. And you can see that people in the social work thought that thought that what they were doing was quite worthless. Because we were only extending to a handful of peoples some of the benefits that the capitalist regime had bestowed upon us, instead of throwing all our energy into an attempt to change the economic system. But Lily Montagu didn't think in those terms. She wanted, in fact, to extend those benefits that she had to improve living conditions. And she did her utmost to help those women. And she said, I must admit to my deep regret that with few exceptions, our girls have not identified themselves closely with trade organizations. So in 1933, she gained an OBE for her work with the poor. The club was bombed in 1941. Many of her friends were killed, but it continued in different houses in different places. And she became a justice of the peace in her 30s. And these people, these juvenile delinquents, kept in touch with her. They wrote her letters, as I said, calling her mother. And she was especially interested in young ladies in need of care and protection. In other words, they had been prostitutes, and she wanted to try and save them. It's amazing to think of any justices of the peace now receiving fan mail from people they've sent to prison, but there is some for her. Now, her religious work. She had been running Shabbat services, as you heard, for children and women at the club. These informal services, of course, were attended by their mothers, who preferred them to the shul services in the Orthodox communities. And it's clear that the formal structure and rituals in the Orthodox communities was not speaking to the real lives of the women and children. And so she began her quest for a reformed and responsive Judaism. She met Claude Montefiore in the 1890s, and he gave her the means and the confidence to redefine Judaism so as to allow for personal growth and expression. He helped her break with orthodoxy, leading with an estrangement from her father that lasted to her death, to his death in 1911. And of course, we have the three M's: her, Montefiore, and Israel Montague, the first of the liberal rabbis. She wrote an essay in the January 1899 issue of the Jewish Quarterly on the spiritual possibilities of Judaism today. She asked all religious committed Jews to help her form an association aimed at strengthening the religious life of the Anglo-Jewish community through the propagation of liberal Jewish teachings with a sense of spirituality and personal responsibility to God. Sabbath afternoon worship services conducted along liberal Jewish lines and propaganda meetings. You see here a very rare piece of her writing. I can't quite read all of it, but it seems that it might have been one of the sermons, one of the talks, the spiritual possibilities of Judaism today. Yeah, it's an amazing piece of work. And there's a picture of Montagu. Now, during this period of time, we get the foundation of the West Central Liberal Synagogue. Now, it says here that it began in 1928. I don't agree with that. It was there before that. She was running afternoon services from well before that. Not only, of course, because she was aware that the women couldn't, she didn't want to arouse the ire of the Orthodox world or her father, but of course by 1928 he was long dead, but also because she was aware that women had to work on Shabbat morning, and unless there was a service in the afternoon, they couldn't come to one. And she responded to that need. And this is a picture of what I remember and Aaron remembers of the old West Central Synagogue. This was the synagogue where I took my first High Holy Day service as a student at the Lea College, because I wasn't allowed to take a leading role in the service at West London Synagogue. And I went to the college and said, you know, I've got to have some experience. So they put me into West Central, and I had my first service there. And I still feel guilty about it because an old lady collapsed at the back of the hall during Yom Kippur. And at the end of the service, I went and said, who was she? You know, where is she? And no one knew her name, and I couldn't find her. So I felt very guilty. I never got to hospital to visit her. But this is how West Central was at those times. And she was very wary of the fact that women who couldn't earn a decent wage would become prey to predatory rich young men or be ensnared into prostitution. So she started these services, but they really ran from her club. They held services first in Alfred Place, regular lectures with over 100 people attending, a religion school for children under her sister, Netta Franklin, marriages, funerals, babies' blessing, pastoral visiting, family atmosphere. Members could write and apologize if they couldn't make a service. Can you imagine that? Dear Rabbi, I can't come to shul this weekend. Wow. Mind you, some of mine do that at West Central, which is lovely. It helps me know who was there. And this, some of you will recognize some of the people here. Yes, that's, of course, Lea Montague. I don't recognize the others because I wasn't involved in that sort of world. But some of you may remember. I don't know. You can tell me later. The dedication of Whitfield Street, as it was known then, in 1954. Yes, with Lea Montague and Rabbi Edgar. Now, one of the things that happened is that the World Union for Progressive Judaism was founded in 1926. It was suggested by a club member who was annoyed that when she went traveling around the world, she didn't know how to meet other Jews. So Lea Montague suggested an international world conference. And in 1928, she went to Berlin, and there was a worship service there held in Berlin's Reform Temple. And Lea Montague, perhaps the first woman, the first Jewish woman to occupy such a pulpit in Germany, preached the sermon in German on the theme of personal religion. I'd love to know if she met Regina Jonas, Rabbi Regina Jonas, the first true woman rabbi, whether she knew of her existence even. But it's a mystery, I'm afraid, we'll never know, because of course Rabbi Regina Jonas was also forgotten for many years. As you know, she died in Theresienstadt, or at least in Auschwitz, and the rabbis and the people who knew of her work in Theresienstadt never mentioned her when they came here to Britain. So none of us knew of her existence until after I had been ordained, in fact. Miss Montague enjoyed her work enormously. She was elected president of the World Union. She chaired meetings, organized conferences, attracted new members, and when the World Union's headquarters were transferred to the United States, she was named honorary life president, and the foundation of the Montagu Center at the request of the ULPS and the governing body of the World Union for Progressive Judaism happened. And luckily, she retained her strength and vitality into her old age. I found this gorgeous picture of her on her 80th birthday at the LJS, cutting her cake. In that year, in 1954, she wrote in an article, "Friends, I have been very happy all my life. I want to tell you some of the things which have made me so happy. And when you are my age, you will see if you agree with me." The first thing she mentioned was her home, Red Lodge, which she kept with her sister Marion, and the peace and encouragement that she found there with her siblings. And they'd been one of 10, she'd been one of 10 children. She said she couldn't have found a better minion than all her siblings. The second thing was that she was able to translate her faith into life. And she said that the ideas for the development of faith came from Claude Montefiore, and found ways to bring them to fruition, helped by Reverend Mattock. She felt nearness to God, and there was a divine purpose to her life. West Central Synagogue's Hebrew name is Kehila Kadosha Mavakshe Emunah, the holy congregation of the seekers of faith. It was personal faith which was at the center of her life, and how to bring that to her work in amongst the poor and the vulnerable. And she was able to join with others to spread the word of God through religious work and social work. She wrote, "People you serve give you more than you give them," and that her co-workers were her friends. And why have I got a picture of a Bentley? Well, simply because I had a lovely story from one of our older members from West Central, Eileen Berman, who in 1962, living in the East End of London in Islington, Stoke Newington area in a council flat, she was ill, and Lea Montague came to visit her. And you can imagine, her son was telling me, can you imagine, her sister had lent her the Rolls Royce because she was very upset that Lea Montague was still going everywhere by public transport. Lea Montague did not have a car of her own. So she lent her her Rolls Royce with her chauffeur in his uniform. And this Rolls Royce turned up outside these council flats in Stoke Newington with a chauffeur in his uniform while she went to visit Elaine Berman in the flat. And you can just imagine the crowd that gathered round this Rolls Royce. She continued visiting people. She was a little gadfly, spurring others to action, said Claude Montefiore. In fact, she never took credit really for her actions, for the results of her actions herself. And in terms of the development of the World Union and the liberal movement in Britain, most scholars that I have read have suggested that it was actually Lea Montague who did all the work, allowing, of course, the men to take the credit, because she felt that if she had claimed credit as a woman, it would have discredited the work. And some of us will understand that even today, that those things still happen. When I first, that David Berman said she was a real Victorian lady living in the 1960s, but she could also in private be relaxed, very funny, modest, kind, thoughtful, and loyal, but always deferred to her male colleagues. Bertram Jacobs, who was the administrator of the Liebet College when I went there, came to the service that I first took at West Central, about 1974 it must have been, and looked at me on the bimmer and said to me afterwards that he looked at me there and thought of Miss Lily. I hope it was because I was female, not because of how I looked, but you never know. But actually, no women rabbis followed her. It wasn't part really of her vision, just as she wasn't involved in politics or the suffragette movement, really. You see the Montagu Center was established, but Eli Tikvasera, one of my colleagues, said that maybe during her lifetime, there was simply no room for anyone else. And that she didn't see herself as a pioneer or a feminist. She saw herself as called by God as a personal spirituality, to follow the demands of the prophets, to seek solace in the words of the Psalms. And maybe that approach was old-fashioned by 1963. So it wasn't the sort of person that we woman rabbis saw as a rabbi. And I hate to admit it, that until I went to West Central, having sort of grown up in the Reform movement, I knew incredibly little about this wonderful, wonderful woman. Religion urges us, she said, to fight evil as contrary to divine law. It urges us to combat abject misery, sin, and disease, because God is. In his name we can work, as we believe in cooperation with him, since through him goodness must ultimately prevail. And I'm going to finish it there. Hang on, let me get out. Oh, okay. I managed roughly to get there in roughly the right time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I hope you didn't feel that we were rushing you through it. It was so wonderful to listen to you. I had the pleasure of being able to look at everyone's faces, of just being caught up in all the wonderful stories that you shared. There are some wonderful stories also that people, reflections that people shared in the chat. But there was a question, and if we get to it, I will read them out just in case some people can't read the chat. But there was a question by Peter Calvert, who asked, did Lily Montagu have any meaningful contact with the growing Jewish socialist movement in London?
Not that I know of. She wasn't interested in politics. I could be wrong, but I didn't see anything there. You know, if you remember the quotation from Emmeline, or whatever her name was, you know, she was interested in changing the world, but not Lily Montagu. Lily Montagu wanted to change the individual life of the poor.
Wonderful. Do please raise your hands, or just you should be able to unmute
I'm trying
yourself
to look at
if you
some of
want
the
to.
stories, because
yeah, we will get to it as well in a moment. Just while we're waiting for people, if people have questions and want to raise their hands or want to share their comments themselves. Alison Turner just pointed out that the archives, which are at the Montagu Center, show that a lot of the work really was done by Lily Montagu. Owen Power, I think, has a question for you.
Yes, Rabbi Jackie, at last week's talk, my question was, what would Leo Beck say to us as we're celebrating our 120th birthday, in terms of what would he say we're doing wonderfully well with liberal Judaism, and what would he say we need to do better? Now, I really would love to know what you think Lily's message to us would be.
Right. It's a very difficult one, this one, because many of the attitudes that she held are contrary to how I think LJ sees itself now. She was not in favor of intermarriage. She wrote against it. She felt that the couple should decide whether they're going to be, well, in her terms, of course, it was just Judaism and Christianity, but that the couple should decide whether they want to be Jewish, in which case the non-Jew should convert to Judaism, or the couple should be Christian, in which case the Jew should convert to Christianity. But they should not try and hold a mixed faith household, right? So she would, that is contrary, yes. She would have, I am sure, been delighted with the involvement of LJ in the social issues of our day. I'm sure she would have been concerned herself if she, updated her scientific knowledge, of course, one's assuming that she has new knowledge in order to do this, with the environment and how that affects poverty in the world and the vulnerable. Because her concentration was on leveling up, real leveling up, making sure that people have enough to eat and have somewhere safe to live and are regarded as good and citizens of the land. I have a feeling she might have supported the LGBTQ plus stuff in the sense that she felt, but again, of course, that would mean a great jump in her knowledge in order to think this, but she supported that women should be seen, and women were that underclass in that period, that women should be seen as individuals and worthy of respect. And I would hope that she would include these days all peoples in that, of being worthy of respect. I think she might have been perturbed by what I sometimes see is the division between the work of Tikkun Olam and the work of Emunah. She saw the worship of God as being the engine that leads to the betterment of society. I'm not sure in many liberal settings that the engine is that of worship of God. Is that fair? Is that fair?
Thank you. Brian has a question for us.
Yeah, Brian Sass, I'm from Northwood. At Northwood, some of our members, including me, have been to Lily Montague's Saturday Club.
Oh, lovely.
The club was held on the stage at a production of How the West End Was Won, a musical play written by Judy Herman, our member, who's a radio journalist. It gave a feel of the position of the Jews who lived in the West End, a very poor position, not quite as poor as the East End Jews. Right. They were cut above the East End Jews. But it was pretty hard life. And when they got there to the club, there were sandwiches there ready for them when they finished work, after they'd finished work, and all things to make them relax. And we really got the feel of the schmutter business in that whole area there.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very sad that at West Central there were no people who'd gone to the club, as far as I knew, amongst the members at the point that I was there.
So we have a couple of people who recalled going to the club. So I don't know if Jane Singer is still with us, and if she would like to share what she shared in the chat by just unmuting herself. Jane.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a member at the LJS, just in case there's not many people that maybe know me. I went as a child. I was I think younger than perhaps some of the other people that went to the later club. There was a club in the evening. Ours was just, you know, about 3:30, 4 o'clock for an hour or a couple of hours. But my memory is so clear of these two ladies sitting at the end of this hallway. Don't know if any of you went to that place in Hand Court. It's just a little court alleyway off High Holborn, and it was a great building. There was a lovely sort of hall on the ground floor where we did our ballroom dancing. There was a little stage. There was another room off that, which was a large room. I think that might have been used as some sort of dining room. And downstairs, there was a sort of like snooker pool, great big tables, table tennis. And there were older men down there. I suppose they were boys, really. But we didn't really go down there much, you know. But if we did, it was a whole different atmosphere. And then upstairs, there was a large room for art classes, and then another large hall where we did elocution, which I haven't done very well in keeping going. But it was great. We went every Wednesday, and we all, the kids, you know, we came from Holborn, and there were some other girls from the West End, from Wardour Street, round there. And so we were all from the same area, really. And there was just a group of us, and we, you know, had a good time. As I said, it was really fundamental part of my childhood. You know, we did the Shema, we said it, we didn't really know what we were saying, but we learnt it by rote and said it, and ran about, and, you know, had a good time. And the mums all sat in a corner around the table having a natter and talking about all the things that mums need to talk about. And I don't think there were any boys that came, maybe one or two. But it was just, yeah, those two ladies, they just sat there. And when I joined the LJS and found it was connected to Lily Montagu, which I didn't know before, I thought, hey, I'm coming home now, because it's like a full circle. So I had to listen to you, Jackie, today. So it's been lovely to hear you talking.
Lovely to hear the stories.
Absolutely. And there are a couple of others, including, I think we do have, I think it's Terry who says he went to West Central Club. So there must have been some boys there, because he said he met his first wife there. Terry, do you want to just say something?
Well, yes, I went with a friend, and we wanted to join a Jewish youth club when we were about 17. And his brother had been to West Central earlier. And so we went there, although he lived in Southgate and I lived in Whetstone. So it was quite a journey for us in those days. We met some wonderful friends there. I mean, some of the things we enjoyed the most were socials that we had on Thursday evenings, if I remember rightly, kind of disco, I suppose. I learned to jive there. One of the girls could jive, and she taught all the boys to jive, actually. And as I said in my chat, I met my wife there, and which really was, you know, what it was all about, going to a Jewish club to meet Jewish girls and so on. It was great. And
you're still friends with a lot of them.
Well, yes, as I said, we at the time, 10 of us got married in 1961 and 62, and we determined to meet once a month together. At first, we did have dinner in each other's homes every month. Now we're older, we go out to lunch at restaurants. But yes, it was a wonderful part of my life.
My husband, Larry, actually lived one of the years he was at Leabeck College in Ham Court and worked with the club. It was one of the last years I think the club was in existence. So he lived in Holborn in Ham Court, where the club was.
Wonderful. What a wonderful connection also. And really wonderful to see so many of you sharing your personal memories in the chat. We do save the chat, so if anyone didn't manage to read the chat, then just send us an email and we can forward you the messages in case you missed it during the session and you want to see some of the memories. Jane Rayner had asked me to share a memory which I already shared with Jackie, so don't need to read it out again.
Oh, it's lovely, that memory. Do find it, it's gorgeous. And it said it's Lily Montagu and her sister going on the buses. Obviously her sister didn't lend her the Rolls Royce that day.
Absolutely, absolutely. Unfortunately, our time is never enough. We could reminisce together for more and more time, but what a wonderful evening it was again. What a wonderful celebration. Next week, we are going to come to Rabbi Dr. Andrew Goldstein presenting on maybe somebody from liberal Judaism you are slightly less familiar with, or at least to my shame, I have to admit, I had never heard of her, Amy K. Blank, a beautiful poet, and Rabbi Goldstein will share with us a little bit about her life and some of her beautiful poetry as well. So that's always going to be promising to be a wonderful evening as well. So for now, we're going to say a big thank you to Jackie. Really, what a pleasure it was. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you for organizing,
for joining us.
Thank you very much for organizing it so beautifully.
Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again next week.